Wonderful. Thank you, Andrew. Thank you all so much for being here. Thank you to Pete Lessica for inviting me to this event. And I really am so thrilled and inspired and humbled that so many people are into this topic of combining birds and plants tonight. I also want to give a little preface thanks to a lot of the photographers that I'm friends with, colleagues with, have donated some awesome photos, including the stunning one from my friend Andrea Danino, American three-toed woodpecker, which we'll be definitely talking about tonight. I will try and leave time at the end for questions, so please jot down as we go, but and if we have any, we'll definitely get them out towards the end here. So let's dive right in. So we're going to start out real broad, just saying like, who are woodpeckers? And I'm sure as birders and plant people, we all have so many ways into this question, right? Like we're talking about their foot structure, maybe their incredibly long tongues, their colors, their shapes, their sizes, their habits, their habitats. So many different ways into this question of like what these birds are. Taxonomically, of course, they have a very important family, 22 members across North America, and even more worldwide. They're a very global species or global family as well. And behaviorally, we know them for what they do, right? These are birds who peck into wood and hard surfaces for particular purposes. And one of the things that I want to get at in this talk is that looking not only at the birds themselves, but at the legacies that they leave behind on the landscape and how much we can appreciate about this family from all the evidence that they've left for us to see. This is an acorn woodpecker, one of the species we don't have here in Montana, but this is along more of the coast of California and into the Southwest and down into Mexico. And these birds actually drill holes for individual acorns that they plug into these granaries for food storage later. One of the many very idiosyncratic behaviors that members of this family have. But I'm bringing this into the kind of with a lens of what I call wildlife tracking. And for those of you who aren't familiar with this, one of the ways that I like to describe it sometimes is thinking of a practice of identifying and interpreting the indirect evidence of animal presence. And so we can all go out and see birds physically, make contact with the living animal. And this can be true of any animal we're talking about, whether it's a mountain lion or a moose or a bark beetle, right? There are so many different ways to be directly in contact with that animal. But there are also so many legacies that they leave all across the landscape that people hardly appreciate sometimes, that we can dig deeper into that. And when we talk about wildlife tracking, it's very much an inquiry-driven process of asking all those questions. It's forensic, it's aesthetic. There are so many different ways you can look at tracks and sign across the landscape. And these are some of the questions that you can think about of like, who was here by a given track or sign or whatnot. You can talk about what were they doing, at any given point when they made that track or sign, right? That's kind of a behavioral component to what we can interpret. We can ask where they were going, maybe like if this is a trail or a different pattern of an animal that moves across distance. How was this made? That's really going to get into some of what we'll talk about anatomically of what that animal has at its capacity to make any given track or sign. Very important with woodpeckers. And then why did this happen? Was there a motive behaviorally, socially, or ecologically that this was inspired, that inspired this animal's activity? And I like this photo here from a colleague, Larry Masker, who works in the Adirondacks of New York, but he's taken photos all over the continent, just showing these two hairy woodpeckers here, and of course they're on a beaver chew, right? So this is just one of those things that sign is layered all across the landscape, leaving evidence of life. So just paying attention to that really is what wakes me up in the morning. So today we're going to go through a couple different stages in this presentation. I want to introduce you or refresh you for those of you birders who know them already. We want to get to know some of these Montana woodpeckers that we have here. We have 10 species in our state, and a couple accidental species that sometimes come in. But we're going to go through that pretty quickly because, again, I want to spend more time on the actual tracks and sign that we can look at to appreciate these woodpeckers. And to do that, I sometimes call it the ABEs, looking at the anatomy of woodpeckers or any animal we can do this with, but looking at the anatomy, that they can leave parts of their body on the landscape sometimes that we can appreciate. And then we'll segue a little bit into the behavior. And this is some of the sign from the woodpecker's activities. This is what we really kind of have in our mind about the woodpecker's holes. They're foraging, they're digging, and they're probing into soil sometimes. All these different things we'll look at. And then we'll broaden out at the end, looking at some of the ecological ramifications of the influence of these behaviors that they have. This is a beautiful photo of a red-headed woodpecker, by the way, from a friend and colleague, Craig Barfoot. All right, to start with our smallest and go to some of our biggest, through some of these groups again here of the woodpeckers we have in our state. These are all images from Birds of the World Online, a great atlas and resource for learning all about birds. And I just wanted to call that out here. But the downy and the hairy, these are two black and white lookalikes that we can see all across the state. These guys are very widespread and have a lot of similar habits, but a little bit different niches based on the size of their bill and how they can access materials, which we'll look at. The downy has the claim to fame in our state as the smallest woodpecker. These guys are of the same genus, Picoides, and they are our beetle foraging specialists. So these guys are going right under the bark, going after bark beetles and sometimes bark or wood boring beetles as well. And these guys are very anatomically complex, as the name of the American three-toed implies. They only have 3 toes, which we'll look at why that's significant. And they have very refined connections to disturbance. And that's not only logging and wind throw and that type of disturbance, but also forest fire, which is a major role in the life of the blackback woodpecker. And then the sapsuckers, also a very name. They live up to their name for sure, and we will talk about that. But these guys are migratory. They're not here right now or all year. But once they get here, they're fiercely territorial and are very seasonally savvy about what they're eating and changing through the season. So they have a lot of neat foraging behaviors as well. We have 3 species in Montana right now. The Lewis and the red-headed woodpeckers are some of the toughest for this particular topic because their sign is often subtle. We know less about them than we know about other woodpeckers, but they are very bold and conspicuous when we do see them. These are colorful woodpeckers, and they're relatively weak excavators, and so these sometimes come after the ones that are stronger. And then the northern flicker. Montana's pretty special in that we have, we're kind of at the confluence or the intergrade zone of the yellow-shafted flicker, which lives to the east, and the red-shafted flicker, which lives in the western part of the states, west of the Rockies. And so we kind of have a blend at times of all 3, and we'll see why their feathers are important. But these guys are behaviorally very different from some of the other woodpeckers that we'll talk about tonight, and their sign shows that as well. And then, of course, the pileated woodpecker, our biggest, strongest, most powerful woodpecker, can do a lot of damage to trees in mature, complex forests where they thrive. I like to say, as we segue into the anatomy part of this now, I like to say a lot of times, if you want to learn how an animal lives, you really have to look at their skull and their feet. Okay, this is where we can learn so much about how they interact with the ground that they're touching when they do touch down, and how they ingest food every day, right? This is something that the animal relies on for sustenance daily. And so if you want to learn about how they're interacting with the world, this is a great way to do that. Woodpecker, or the pileated woodpecker in particular, is an animal that is, or is one of the woodpeckers that's on the ground a lot. And so they're one of our most vulnerable to predation. And we'll look at that as well. So the skull and bones of an animal are something that we can find to forensically interpret what happened to that animal, how they lived. And even if you didn't know right off the bat who this species was by just the single skull, there were other feathers around as well. But even if you didn't know that, you could tell a lot that this is a powerful bird with a very strong, sharp bill that is built for something very specialized. And so when we look at the skulls and bills of a lot of different woodpeckers, we can see a lot of adaptations for the particular woodpecking niche that they have in the world. Woodpeckers can amazingly hammer 20 times per second. Okay, that's a lot of that's a lot of pecking per second, with as many as 12,000 strikes per day. Okay, each of those pecks has about the hammering power of 1,200 G's of force, and a G is a measure of acceleration against the speed of gravity. So that's a physics concept that I'm still working through myself. But to put that in perspective, for a human to have a concussion, it's typically less than 100 G's. So just a relative difference there. So what enables woodpeckers with their anatomy and their skull to peck that hard, that much, and not get concussions? If we look at these photos here, we can see that the biggest or the hardest hammerers going from A to I, okay, the strongest, hardest hammerers are at the top there. They have wide bills. They have longer, stronger bills, and they're also flatter, okay? So that reduces a lot of up and down motion of the bill, like into the skull. And that bony part that is overhanging there is called like a frontal overhang. And so in some of these woodpeckers that are especially adapted to pecking and flaking in hard wood, they have that structure going on that separates them from some of the weaker excavators, like the flicker and the Lewis woodpecker, down towards the bottom. Okay, we used to have all kinds of crazy theories about their tongue insulating and protecting their brain as they peck, or the bone itself was a spongy absorbent material. And some of those theories have been called into question in the last couple of years as people have looked more into this as well. Going from skulls and bones, feathers are something we can definitely find across the landscape, both from predation again, but also just natural molting. Both birds are always leaving out their feathers, as we know. Molting is a very complex process. But these are all different primary feathers from different types of woodpeckers that we can have in Montana. The red-bellied is sometimes an accidental species. That's why he has the asterisks there. But all four of these show a pretty strong resemblance of a very different patterns, but all a very strong black and white coloration. That's a good theme across a lot of woodpeckers that we see, except for some of those Melanerpes species that do have a lot of color. That black and white coloration adds a lot of camouflage in the dappled light and shade and sun where they live in the forest. And so this is an important adaptation that they have as well. So the moral of this slide is that anytime you find a very polka dotted looking black and white checkered feather, or a bicolored one like in the pileated, you can start to lean into this might be a woodpecker possibility. The tail feathers of woodpeckers are especially important because they are used as a brace or a prop when they're leaning back as they're going in to peck against the wood. They often come, or always come, to a point at the end, like we see in this northern flicker feather on the left and right here. The feather on the left side in the right photo, that is the top of the feather, and on the underside is the side that is colored orange like that. So this is one of the red shafted flickers from the western part of the state here. But that shaft going down between the two veins of the feather there is extremely stiff, some of the stiffest in the bird world, really, because they do rely on it so much to brace back as they're leaning to do their work. And so if you ever get a chance to touch one of these feathers, either from a molt or a kill, just try and bend it a little bit and see how, or we can see with these guys up here delicately. And so that confers a lot of strength to these guys as they do their pecking. And then their feet, right? I talked about the skull and the feet being supremely important for wildlife tracking as a way to understand how the animal lives. Woodpeckers have a very unique foot structure, right? We think of most birds in the classic formation of having 3 toes forward and 1 toe back, right? If you think of that kind of stereotypical kindergarten bird track that everyone can draw, that is not the case with every bird, right? There are web-footed birds. There are birds that have all different types of foot structures. And the woodpeckers are unique in that they have 2 toes forward and 2 toes pointing back. That's how they arrange their toes in that way. And that's what we call that zygodactyl arrangement, something that they actually share with owls and roadrunners. But in the woodpecker's case, this is an adaptation for perching, okay? Then when they're climbing, like in that woodpecker we see in the left photo there, they can actually swing that 4th toe up a little bit to have this ectrodactyl, meaning that it actually can splay out more to give them more purchase into the wood as they're climbing. So a very specialized, flexible 4th toe that enables that behavior. On the right-hand side there, we can see a northern flicker, actually, and you can see the little scissor-like feet here of the toes, and this woodpecker is doing a little bit of a hop or almost a skip here, but that is the pattern of its movement across the ground. The flicker is the second most common bird or woodpecker we have that touches the ground, and we'll see that right here as well. Another northern flicker track, example of tracks on the left side. And then on the right side, we also see another common ground dweller, the pileated woodpecker, which is very comfortable going on horizontal logs or on the ground or getting up close to where their food source is, which I'll be talking about there. And you can see that track if you look right here. It's almost about 2 inches long, well over 2 inches really. And it has that kind of X or backwards K looking shape a little bit, depending on which side of the foot they are in. Okay. So transitioning now to some of the behavioral components. All right. So what are they doing? How are they using the anatomy that they are endowed with? And we can ask a number of questions for any given sign that we suspect might be a woodpecker's work, okay? And these questions can help us get to the species that might be doing this work. The top question that is always just like glaring is like, what is the visual appearance of that sign? We can talk about how deep it is, the extent of it is, or the extent of how far up or down the tree or whatnot, and the age we might suspect it is. Does this look really fresh or old or new, that type of thing? The second question we can ask is thinking about what anatomical tool that might have been used to make that sign. And of course, woodpeckers don't have the tools I'm mentioning here, but you can imagine that their bills or the anatomy that they have could replicate or could mirror some of these tools. Is this like a hatchet going very hard into the wood? Is it more of a chisel that's getting under there and flaking something out? Or is it a fine scale, surgical movement of some tweezers going in there to extract something, that type of thing. Thinking then about what is the plant species or condition that is affected by that sign? What is the likely target prey? And is there any associated sign nearby? And those are the scats, the tracks, and feathers that we've already talked a little bit about. And so on this sign, we can see a little birch twig, carved up in a very particular way. And these holes are probed in there, and then the bark is flaked back, making this kind of three-sided occlusive door-like structure in each of that. And this is a very singular behavior for this particular species, the downy woodpecker, that has a habit. They're not very strong excavators. They have very small bills, but they can poke along the edges of the side of very punky, rotting birch bark and flip it out to make these, sometimes we call them like trapdoor looks to that. And they're going after these cossid moths a lot of times that are nesting, or not nesting, but maturing in the punky, rotten bark of, or wood of the birch there. And so this is a typical look that they can have as they do that work. On the right or left-hand side, you can see them doing that with those doors. And all these little slash marks in there are those woodpeckers' feet as they go. They're very sharp nails as they dig into that very soft, etchable birch bark. And you don't always see that on the trees that woodpeckers are on, but this is just one woodpecker that was just having a field day on that particular piece of birch. Another thing the downies are noted for are pecking really crisp holes into goldenrod galls and other types of galls and vegetative herbaceous materials that you might not think of for a woodpecker, right? This is a herbaceous material, but goldenrod galls like this have very important food sources within them, and downy woodpeckers are one of the specialists in the woodpecker family of going after them. Going into sapsuckers a little bit, these guys have a very strongly identifiable sign that we can't always identify to the particular species. Sometimes we can, but not always. But all these two, and also the yellow-bellied in the far east of Montana, can do these horizontal holes that you see going across and around this birch tree. In two different ages here, mind you. Do you see the different coloration there? That's showing the ones on the top, showing that that's quite fresher look. The ones on the bottom are probably last year's. These guys are birds that come back to the same little grove or stand of trees year after year after year and defend it as they set up their territories to raise their young. And so what are those holes? These are actually sap wells that they're drilling into the tree as the sap is flowing. And that is about 20% of their annual diet. So that's not the only thing they eat, as their name might imply. They actually require a lot of protein-rich, fat-rich insects, especially in the breeding season. But it's a very important component of their diet through the year. And so they're tapping this just like people in the East do with maple trees, right? It's a certain behavior that really capitalizes on that flow of the tree's vital nutrients. I say here about the red napes tapping conifer xylem early in the spring, and we can see this on that lodgepole pine here on the left. The xylem, of course, is that water-rich, very more liquidy, flowing material that comes faster in the year or sooner in the year seasonally. But as the season progresses, the sapsuckers, red nape sapsuckers particularly, will often move to deciduous trees like this speckled alder here, where they're still tapping wells into the tree, but they often bleed together more and make these waffle-like patterns as opposed to individual pecking holes. And the phloem tissue is what comes through later in the season that they're really relying on as a much more nutrient-rich food source. The next group that is a very foraging, has just fascinating foraging behaviors are the black-backed and American three-toed woodpeckers, okay? As I mentioned at the outset, these guys are the beetle foraging specialists of our woods for both bark beetles and, in the blackback's case, wood boring beetles. And these guys have a very strong knack for flaking bark from the tree, from dead or dying trees. And we'll see that in a second. The blackback presented here on the left, or on the right, sorry, as the live animal, showing some of their sign up close. And then on the left there, showing some of their habitat, is a particular important first responder to some of these high severity burns that we have. We often think these are, lifeless landscapes out there where everything has been lost, but these guys are the ones that capitalize on those beetles that sock in when the come in. And so this is where, when a burn happens, 1 to 8 years after a big burn is when the blackbacks really thrive. And it's a great place to see them and their behaviors. I have a little example here of the, let's see if we can get that to work, of the three-toed doing its action here. So on the photo on the left-hand side, I will get this, just watch this woodpecker at work. Seeing how they come at it from a side angle, right? It's kind of the swipe that is prying underneath the bark and bringing it back, right? They're not trying to bore into the sapwood at all, or certainly not in the heartwood. They're just after that exterior shell of the bark to get in there. And this can be quite extensive. You see on the middle photo there, total bark show all around that tree there. And then up close there on the right, just showing an example of how they can get those galleries, right, where those larval beetles are moving around, is what they're after. Okay, this is just a little a little tangent, but just showing that there are many things that can always be confused with tracks and sign, right? And so in this one, I was just trying to show, all this bark is removed. But you can note here, back to like what tools this animal using. We don't see any of the galleries here in the same way. We don't see the bark flaked off. This is actually made, does anyone know what this is made by? It's actually a bear that was making this, right? So the bear has come down from the bottom of the base of the tree, ripped up that bark, and is scraping their incisors up and down there, going after the cambium in the tree. There's a lot of species, from voles to bears to people to beavers, that are reliant on that sugary layer between the bark and the sapwood of a tree that a woodpecker doesn't have as much use for, but their sign can superficially be confused with that sometimes. So just a fun one to compare with a little bit there. And then, hey, there are some woodpeckers that are not in wood. They're not into the wood for foraging as much. And this is particularly true with the northern flicker. These guys, like I said a couple slides ago, these guys are on the ground a ton. They are literally ant eaters. They love to eat all kinds of ants, particularly the smaller ones that we find, the field ants, sometimes the Formica species that are mound type ants or thatch ants, different types of ants that we have. And they will use their bill for going into the surface of the soil to pry out some of that as well. And so this is a little hole that a woodpecker, a flicker has made there, and left 2 scats beside it. Scats are some of that associated evidence I talk about, and that white coating is very common among a lot of different birds, have a different texture of kind of the uric acid coming across in their scat. But when you pulverize a flicker scat, you can literally see there's exoskeletons, ant bodies in there, showing what they had been eating before. Okay? Keep this in mind as we talk now about affiliated, another ant eater of a kind, but a quite different strategy for that. These guys are going into the wood, right? We talked about these are the ones with the hatchet-like bills that can go deep, very deep, farther than your fist into the tree. And they like the big, black, juicy carpenter ants. That's their favorite food. And so they're really into the dead or dying trees where carpenter ants thrive. And And carpenter ants, as you may know, work from the base of a tree, right? And a lot of times. And so they often draw these pileated woodpeckers down to the bottom of a tree where they thrive. They also, like the blackback and three-toed, can leave enormous quantities of wood chips at the base where they have been working, right? And they also leave some dark, moist scats that we can compare with the pileated in a minute, or sorry, the flicker in a minute. And this is just showing a nice hollowed out, burned out, dead tree for sure that the pileateds have gone into on the left side. And then I like this one on the right, just showing that trees can heal from woodpecker damage, right? This is a neat example of a cedar closing up its bark, healing itself from the woodpecker's damage there on the right-hand side. Couple different examples here of how pileatids are active. Sure, we are familiar with this sign to some extent. Those deep cavernous holes there on the left side. Some of the ones there on that central photo showing how they are actually working quite low. Again, where those carpenter ants are active and going all the way into the root structure, right? That's a pretty neat approach there. On the far right side, this is not the pileatid's work itself, but just showing an example of the carpenter ants and what they are doing. They are also making very distinctive Swiss cheese holy gallery-like sign in the back. And this is little clip just shows them coming out one at a time, taking out all these little wood sawdust chips, right? And this is the sign that they're going to leave behind. If I was a pileated woodpecker, that would be supreme right there. But luckily, for the ant's sake, the pileated was not right there at the moment. But all of those carpenter ants are not actually eating the wood. Okay, they're actually removing it from their interior area where they live and build their colony. But in doing so, they draw a lot of woodpeckers to themselves as they make those galleries. All right, this is just a sequence. Again, my friend Andrea just captured a really stunning 4x here, showing how pileatids will listen a lot. They have very good hearing and can listen to the ants as they're under there. I think that's part of what this young bird is doing, this female. And then just showing that anatomically very going in there under, craning the head, going in there with the tweezers of the beak, then from the hatchet to the tweezers, removing that bark, and then going in here on that last, on the bottom right, with their tongue, right? Woodpecker tongues are anatomically fascinating in themselves in that they extremely long, barbed at the ends, and so that they can latch onto insects as they literally slurp them up, like this gal is doing here on the this down log here. And woodpecker pileatids are not only after carpenter ants. This is an example here using that hatchet to get into some bark beetles again. And on the right side, we can see a pileatid going in after a very unique forest insect called a sequoia pitch moth, which makes these big bases of lard-like substance coming out of the tree as the tree is trying to heal itself from the moth surrounded by that. But we can tell this is a pileated again by the size and the texture of the hole, the depth of that hole and that rectangular shape. But also, if you can see it by this little scat there by the entrance hole there. And so pileatids can leave that associated sign to help us infer their presence. This is what a scat of a pileated looks like up close. Pretty goopy, pretty wet, pretty nasty. But nevertheless, it tells us a lot about what they were eating, okay? These are all carpenter ant bodies inside these scats here. So this is not as kind of dusty and sandy as we expect from the flicker, who ingests a lot of sand and grit as they're going into the dirt for their kinds of ants. But these guys going into the wood for the carpenter ants can ingest a lot of these very juicy big ants as they go. All right, another little trick photo a little bit here. This is Actually not a pileated woodpecker again, but often confused because it's a lot of bark removed, right? But this is just so extensive and so immense that this is actually another bear, okay? Just showing another comparison here. That bears, in this example, do have the same food source and same intent as the woodpecker, but using it for a different purpose. And you may see this on downed, dead, wood like this, or stumps, where a bear will actually go in there, rip it out with their paw, and go after the ants with their own tongue, which is equally hungry. And then transitioning into the second last part of the behavioral component, just looking at some of their nesting. Okay, these are just a couple generalities here about nesting behaviors. Both sexes in woodpeckers are contributing often to the excavation of nests, which is pretty awesome. And males do a lot of the work, not all of it, but often contribute a lot here. This is a male pileated here, helping out with this excavation. Cavities can take quite a while to reach their full extent, depending on the woodpecker species, depending on how, what they've selected. But 2 to 3 weeks is a pretty long time. And 6 weeks for some species is a very long time. So they are often arriving on the scene and beginning their nesting process a lot earlier than other birds are at that time. Their nest cavities are unlined, okay? These are interior at the bottom of rotting wood, and so some of it has decomposing sawdust and wood chips of that type, but they're not deliberately bringing in anything to add to that nest as they're building it. And nests may sometimes be used as roosts. When pileatids make roosts, in this case, they'll have multiple entrance holes sometimes along the trunk, and they're often bigger than a particular nest, because when you have a nest, the idea of the hole itself and the nest is only to be big enough, to house or to fit your body and those offspring that you're raising. And so you don't want it to be too big for that. But for overnight stays and for some of that other time for roosting, they can be of different sizes. Nests are not often reused in woodpecker world, except by those weaker excavators, like the Lewis's woodpecker, red-headed woodpecker, northern flicker. Those are the ones that can reuse more than other ones that are more capable of excavating strong nests each year. And so like we did with the foraging questions, you can ask a series of questions for any nest hole that you suspect was made by a woodpecker, to ask, to kind of learn about what species might be making that. One of the big ones to understanding is just kind of like, what habitat type is this nest hole located? Okay, certain species like the pileated really thrive in some of those mature, complex forests. This tree that you see here on the left is an enormous old growth and then dead ponderosa snag. Okay, very high, going up there. The photo doesn't even do justice to the height of this tree. Species and condition of the tree. Again, I just hit on 2 of those a little bit, but this is it's ponderosa. It's a snag, right? One of those dead trees that has no life in it, in the tree's life left, but it still has capacity to give life to other species that can use it. How high is the nest on the tree? That's a really important one for thinking about these different woodpeckers, because certain ones, like the flicker, are comfortable going down low, up 5 meters or so. This pileated hole on the far left side, that's up at least 25 meters in the tree, okay? So quite high in the tree. And then the size and the shape of the entrance hole is also important for understanding this. Some just a perfect circle. Some, like the pileated, actually have more of like a peak or an irregular shape with like a peak or a corner at the top. That's what we see here if we look at the top, the entrance hole is that piece, if you can, yeah, that guy right there. If just below the top entrance or the top of the screen there is where that hole is. And that size, I could see through binoculars and whatnot, that is an irregular shape. It's quite large. It's more than a body of a flicker or a sapsucker could fit through, right? Too big for those guys. And so that really fit for that. And then an added complexity of nesting is that there are the primary excavators that build the holes initially, but then there can always be secondary nesters, right? And we know that our bluebirds, our swallows, some of the swallows, chickadees here, like we saw, chickadees will often use woodpecker nests. And again, if we saw that, we would know, first of all, those eggs are too small. I don't have any scale there, but those are very small eggs. But then remember that lined cavity, right? A woodpecker would never line its cavity with some of those nice grasses and some deer hair in there, actually. And those speckled eggs are all great indicators of the chickadee. But these are just an example of a secondary nester coming in after that primary excavation of, in this case, probably a flicker. Although chickadees themselves, that particular group, can also help expand or sometimes even add on to a dugout nest. One of the important parts about nesting is the woodpecker's reliance on decay and the heart rot of trees. And we often think of rot as has a negative connotation, but for a woodpecker, that is like a very important feature of how they can get into a nest to have the depth that they need, also to have the insulation and the ability to have, all their eggs. That's a big, for some of them, that's quite a clutch of life in there. And so they require decay. The heart rot fungus, this particular one, Felinus tremulae, is a very important one on trembling or quaking aspen. Okay, and this is one that you can see, you can detect its presence by these conchs that you see here on the left side. Going two at the bottom there, one there in the middle, and then a couple more going up. And red-nape sapsuckers are actually notorious for really using that to their advantage. And because they come back to the same area year after year and make these perfect circular holes for their nesting, they will make each nest just above one of those conchs and then bore down into it, because they know that the heart rot is working its way from the ground up through the tree, and so they have a lot more boring capacity there. And so you can see the nest hole in that left image there is right at the above that conch there on that that fungus, which is pretty neat. On the right-hand side photo, you can also see a nest hole right here. And this is also above a tree, or in a tree that is starting to be impacted by the fungus as well as it works its way up the tree. And so red-nape sapsuckers have a very strong affinity with aspen trees for nesting, and in particular these ones that are affected by this heart rot. And then the blackback woodpecker and the three-toed both have a very strong affinity for making this distinctive feature on nests. If you can look at this one here on the left-hand side, if you see this bottom edge there, it's kind of like a little ramp or a slope that goes up into the nest itself. And if you see that on a tree, sometimes it's impossible to distinguish those two, but those two are known for doing that, going up into the nest itself. So it has that little sloping character as well. Blackbacks will also sometimes shear off all the bark around a live tree, around the nest hole. Again, with their flaking capacity, they do that to enable the sap flow going up and around the hole, potentially to deter kind of other predators that might be coming into their nest hole, which is pretty neat. This is a northern flicker here on the right, of course, with some nestlings that are going in there. And you can see even in their hole there that it's a little rougher on the outside, right? This just shows a little bit of the imprecision, and they often are going into a little bit more higher rot and softer wood snags for what they do. And because again, they are not the strongest excavator of the bunch for what it's worth. Then I wanted to segue and finish with just going into some of these ecological ramifications. We've talked a little about the anatomy of how they, the physical parts of their body that do this. And that we can find on the landscape, the skulls, bones, feathers, and tracks. We've talked a little bit about their behavioral components, where we can see how they're doing these foraging and nesting behaviors. And as we close here, I just want to finish on highlighting some of that sign that we can see in other life forms across the landscape. A lot of the woodpeckers that we have in Montana are reputably what we can call keystone species, right? Where they have an outsized influence on other life around them. This is a really fun graphic from a great article that I would recommend called The Whole Story. It was published last April in Cornell's publication, and it really just shows some of the manifold or myriad connections that can happen both from primary excavators to secondary excavators, which we see in kind of the bolder black arrows. Like we see kind of in here we see some examples of the pileated helping out the Barrow's goldeneye over there. We see the northern flicker helping out the bufflehead, and the bluebird, of course. So those are some of the primary to secondary nest excavation connections. But then those white arrows are also showing like the tertiary parts of where food web connections are being enhanced by this by the holes that the primaries initially are making. Okay, and so some of that is like the mouse going into these holes and plugging them up and making their winter nest in there, which certainly happens. Or squirrels harvesting mushrooms, putting them up in the tree, spreading the spores and making that fungal decay happen in more complex and new ways. And the connections are just infinite there, but just highlighting that the food webs, maintaining and connecting those are important. Supporting that decay process, again, spreading around those spores and enabling some of that heart rot, and then creating those cavities where life can happen. And Kathy Martin, who was a really great, or still is a really great researcher of woodpeckers, coined this concept of kind of like the nest web, in the sense that we have the food web where we have trophic connections of predation and consumption by what we're eating, but the nest web is actually having that same connected effect by what birds are providing by the holes that they excavate. And so it's a really important concept to think about as we're thinking about woodpeckers. This is one of the examples here that I just drew in for fun from another Audubon Society, the East Cascades Audubon Society near Bend, Oregon, and some other partners have been working on this really neat project to look at how primary excavators, right, are going to particular trees, trying to figure out which trees are most important for that species. You can see there's a lot of influence on the ponderosa and the aspen there. But then which ones are the secondary nesters or users of those that they're drawing from the primary. And so you can see again all those chickadees, bluebirds, nuthatches, wrens, swallows, owls even in this particular system that they've studied. It's a pretty cool way to look at how wide and powerful the influence of woodpeckers is on all these species. Bringing it back to Montana and just bridging it out a little bit, there are 1,878 species all around the world that nest in tree cavities. Not all of those are woodpecker made, but 338 are. And I think that's pretty stunning. Okay, so this is just showing how much life beyond themselves that woodpeckers support, because that number is not even including the woodpeckers that reuse or use it themselves. So that's a pretty fun global stat to think about. But then I also like to think about it in what's going on in our state here, right? In Montana, this past year, we just came out with the 2025 draft State Wildlife Action Plan. And these are really important documents that help to justify funding resources and where we're going to allocate priorities for restoring species and conserving those that are at greatest risk around the state. And we have 6 woodpeckers that are on the important list called the species of greatest conservation need. And so they are facing consequences of their own, but they benefit at least 18 other species of greatest conservation need around the state through their direct activities. And so this past year was one of the first times in a state wildlife action plan that people or our Fish, Wildlife, and Parks has actually called out keystone species as helping to benefit these other ones. And so woodpeckers were in there, beavers were certainly in there, and prairie dogs were also an important component into that. And so I like to think of how woodpeckers are not only at risk themselves, but have a very crucial, critical role for restoring and amplifying the habitat of other species. So I was just thrilled this year just to see how that happened in the State Wildlife Action Plan. This photo here is one of my favorite animals. I also do a lot of work with forest carnivores and have done a lot of work with marten, another arboreal marten or arboreal weasel family member. But this guy is actually a fisher, okay? And so he is one of our, they actually have natal dens in trees, often using woodpecker holes for their natal dens. And they are one of our mammalian species of greatest conservation need in Montana. They only occupy a small part of Montana right now along the Idaho border. So really neat connection there with a really fun and fascinating arboreal weasel family member. And I think I'm going to leave it there for now. I'm really thrilled you guys were all here tonight and were willing to listen to some of this. I am always here for questions now or anytime at this email. I do a lot of different wildlife tracking work in field surveys, as well as in training and teaching for at different entities around the state and beyond. And so feel free to reach out to me for that. I wanted to also mention this entity called Tracker Certification North America that I work with. Does a lot of great work certifying people in these tracks and sign identification and interpretation skills. I just helped out with one in my near my home in the Swan Valley this past week. Swan Valley Connections is a great hub of this around the state, and so you can get involved and learn more about that at trackercertification.com. And then I just wanted to just share a couple of resources. People are always curious about how to learn more, and these are some of my favorite field guides and things that I use relevant to this topic. Of course, there are many more, but those 2 Peterson guides, the one about woodpeckers is just a great encyclopedia of woodpecker lore, and then a couple tracking related things connected to birds. And then this really great new book just published this past year. Some of you might know about it already, but by Dick Hutto, who's a great woodpecker biologist who's done an extensive amount of work with blackback woodpeckers. And so this is just a wonderful homage, particularly to that species, but also about how complex forest ecosystems can be before, during, and after fire, and how woodpeckers are a great part of that. So that's all I got for you right now. Again, I welcome questions, and thanks for being here.